Right. Believe it or not, the only comic books I read when I was a kid were the Archies. I skip any online trivia game that asks me to distinguish between DC and Marvel superheroes because I know I will fail them. I've never been to Comic-Con. I have only seen a handful of superhero movies, and only then at the insistence or the invitation of my sons. So, when the phrase Justice League came up in Jeff and my discussions about the message this week, I had to Google it to find out which comic book empire that they belonged to. As I skimmed over the extremely detailed Wikipedia article, one phrase stood out to me. The Justice League often unite to face supervillains who pose catastrophic challenges to the world. The Bible has its own Justice League. You recognize any of them? Most of the Old Testament prophets who warned Israel and Judah of God's impending judgment list the kings, priests, and people's negligence of justice for those living on the margins of society, widows, orphans, and foreigners usually. And they list that as a reason for the punishment God is going to bring down upon these two nations. The prophet Micah cries out, "Hear this, leaders of the house of Jacob, rulers of the house of Israel, you who reject justice and make crooked all that is straight, who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with injustice. Her officials give justice for a bribe, and her priests teach for hire." Jeremiah, if you're doing the Read Through the Bible calendar, he was one of our chapters yesterday. He reminds them, if you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place. Isaiah tells them that God demands that they wash, be clean, remove your ugly deeds from my sight. Put an end to such evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Help the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow. And the prophet Amos warns them that God is tired of all the games that they're playing. Take away the noise of your songs. I won't listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. But the people of Israel and Judah ignore all the prophets' calls. Their calls for justice, their calls for righteousness, and they end up being carried off into exile, right? Which is what we kind of talked about last week. Justice is important to God. How his people treat others is important to God. And how his people stand up for those who are being treated unkindly and unjustly is very important to God. I think we're all born with a sense that there should be justice. The superhero action genre of comic books, movies, and action figures depends on that desire for justice to be served. The theme verse for our current series is Ephesians 6:10, "Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power." It's the same verse used in online Bible school. After this verse, Paul describes the armor of God, and this week I'm reading from the CEB version. "Therefore, pick up the full armor of God so that you can stand your ground on the evil day, and after you have done everything possible, still stand. So stand with the belt of truth around your waist," talked about that last week, "justice as your breastplate, and put shoes on your feet that you are ready to spread the good news of peace." So last week we armored up with truth, and this week we're going to armor up with justice. Last week, we heard the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue in Babylon. They told the king the truth. "We can't worship your idol. We will only worship the God of Israel, the one true God." And this honesty got them thrown into the fiery furnace, where an angel of God protected them from the flames. After their survival, King Nebuchadnezzar had some crazy dreams and visions about this God that they were talking about. And Daniel, another young Israelite in exile, interpreted those dreams for the king as predicting Nebuchadnezzar would lose his kingdom, go a little crazy, and end up eating grass. Daniel was a truth teller too. But he added that Nebuchadnezzar's kingship would be restored if he acknowledged that the God of Israel rules the world. Daniel advised the king to remove his sin by doing what's right and remove his wrongdoing by showing mercy to the poor. Well, the king didn't. And the vision of God driving him out of his kingdom came true. King Nebuchadnezzar had grass for dinner for 7 years. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses, and after he praised, worshiped, and glorified God, he regained his kingship. And he declared, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, worship, magnify, and glorify the King of heaven. All his works are truth, all his paths are justice, and he is able to humble all who walk in pride." Nebuchadnezzar had probably never heard of Goliath, a giant who displayed a lot of pride hundreds of years earlier. But Daniel, the interpreter of his dreams, certainly had. Goliath, along with the rest of the Philistine army, learned the same lessons about the power of the God of Israel that King Nebuchadnezzar did. Now, if you grew up in the church, you've probably experienced the story of David and Goliath. Maybe if you're a little older, it was told to you on a felt board. Maybe you had a coloring page or some stickers. Maybe you made a craft out of cotton balls. Maybe you watched a VeggieTales video. And I admit that I worry a little bit that an entire generation of young adults will always picture Goliath as a cucumber. But the basic plot is this. There are two armies facing each other, neither one really wanting to get into battle too seriously. And David's older brothers are with King Saul and the Israelites. Day after day, the Philistines hurl insults at the Israelites and their God. Goliath is a particularly nasty brute. He's huge, arrogant, and he has no respect for God. When David comes to visit his brothers, he hears Goliath's insults, and he's appalled that no one will do anything about it. Goliath is insulting the holy God of Israel. And no one, not his brothers, not the battle-hardened soldiers, not even King Saul, will do anything to silence this man. Have you ever walked into an uncomfortable situation like that? You come into a place and you see something that's going on that it's just plain wrong. But everybody's sort of standing around, maybe looking at each other uncomfortably with glances that say, isn't anybody going to do something about this? Maybe followed by quickly lowered eyes that clearly show it's not going to be them that does anything. Have you ever walked into a playground or a break room or a sports field or a school cafeteria or a dark street? A place where something bad is going down and nobody is doing anything. David walks onto a battlefield where something bad is happening and nobody wants to step up and do anything about it. David is young. We don't know exactly how young, but he is not a seasoned military veteran or even a raw recruit. However, he's furious about what is being said about his God, and he's furious that it's been going on for so long. David says, if nobody else will do something about this, I will. Have you ever taken on a giant, or a bully, or a rule or law that was just plain wrong? Have you ever called out injustice and stepped up to stop it? A video story from ESPN was promoted on the Knights of North Castle Bible School materials for this week. The full story is linked on our DIY worship page and on our Facebook page. The video highlights something that is unfortunately all too common in our schools today, but not just in schools. It occurs increasingly in our national discourse in politics, in workplaces, and even in families and churches. It's bullying. Bullying is the mistreatment or abuse of someone vulnerable by someone stronger or more powerful. It can be physical, but today it's more often verbal or even psychological. The video shares the story of a high school girl named Shai Johnson. You really should watch it to get the whole video. It's about 9 minutes long, so I wasn't going to show it here. But Shai was born with a congenital neurological defect that affects her skull. And doctors predicted that she would likely be a vegetable, in the words of her dad. But through the efforts of medical experts, major surgeries, and the love of her parents, Shai was later able to go to public school. But Shai's different, and she knows it. When she's bullied by other students in high school, it hurts. And her parents hurt for her. As a parent, I'm sure it hurts them as much as it hurts Shai. Her mom knew another student who was familiar with Shai because he worked with Special Olympics. She reached out to Carson Jones, and asked if he could find out who was bullying Shai. Their story may speak to us living here and now a little better than David and Goliath so many years ago. But there are things that David and Carson do that can help us in confronting injustices we may come across. In our scripture reading, David stood up for God. And sometimes we're in that position, but more often we're in a position to stand up for another person or a group that's experiencing some type of injustice. A position like Carson Jones was in when Shai's mother contacted him. So what are the things that we can learn from them that might make it a little easier to stand up for God and those who are vulnerable? The first thing is they recognized when something wasn't right and they sought to address it. I think sometimes we're a little afraid to even do that. Even when we face much less risk to ourselves, our reputation, or our status than David or Carson did. However, sometimes just one person calling something out is enough to stop what's going on. Just one person to say, this isn't right. When Carson Jones heard about what happened to Shai, he said, this isn't right. Carson was a popular guy in his high school. He gathered his friends around and said, it's not right that kids are bullying Shai. Then he asked them what they should do about it. Like David asked his brothers and King Saul what they were going to do about the way Goliath was insulting their God. But unlike David's brothers and King Saul, Carson's friend actually had some ideas about this, and they were willing to do them. Both David and Carson looked at what they could bring to the situation. Sometimes we kind of have this one-size-fits-all response to bullying or injustice, but David and Carson show us that that's not really the case. David tells King Saul that, he's not as weak as he looks. He's fought bears, he's fought lions who attack the sheep. He is not as unskilled as he thinks he is. Carson, as you know if you watched the video, was the senior quarterback on the high school football team at the time. The friends he talked to were his teammates on that football team. Carson's position gave him some leverage with the rest of the students and his teammates. But would they use that leverage to help Shai, and how? Both Carson and David realize they have to find their own way to handle the situation. David knows he can't wear Saul's armor, right? Saul tries to put his armor on David and it just doesn't work. David has to use his own tools, and he chooses his slingshot, 5 smooth stones, and the power of God. David puts on God's armor instead of King Saul's. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. All of these gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands. Shai's mother had initially asked Carson to simply track down who was doing this, to just find out. And Carson said that's what he planned to do at first, find the bullies and stop them. But his teammates had a better idea, one that used the tools that they had in their toolbox, the fact that they were respected by the other kids. So, Carson and his friends invited Shai to sit with him and his teammates during lunch. They invited her to hang out with them after they were finished eating. They walked her to all of her classes. They made it clear that they valued her as a person. Carson didn't use brute strength to stop the bullying. He just took Shai into his circle, and she was surrounded by care and protection. All those who looked on would see that she is in good hands. She is part of the team. So how about us? Can we recognize when something isn't right and seek to address it? Now, most of us won't be able to take on world hunger or to end racial injustice or relieve national or international suffering. But we may very well have a burden for someone or some group who's not being treated justly. We may have a heart for someone in our workplace or neighborhood or family or school who needs a helping hand. We may be called to fight for a cause the Lord puts on our hearts. Are we open to his leading? Like David and Carson, are we willing to respond? And are we looking for what we can bring to this situation? You know, we may not have the ability to fight bears or lions or sling stones with a slingshot. Well, some of you might be able to do that. But most of us may not have either athletic ability or the platform of a football quarterback. But God has given each of us resources to take on injustice in our world. When I was living and working in the Philippines, I was just one person. I was young, I was shy, and I didn't like conflict at all. But when the American boss of our agency was acting unjustly in our workplace, none of my Filipino coworkers would speak up. The jobs in the camp were really good ones. They were paid in American dollars. We had lawyers and veterinarians working as teachers because the camp paid so well. I'm an American. I could speak up in a way nobody else could in my office. And if I didn't speak up, I learned quickly that nobody was going to do it. You may have financial resources, you may have a clear mind, a big heart, or a strong voice to bring to a cause, to defend somebody or some group, or to help an individual in our lives. What gifts, talents, or resources could you bring to making something wrong in the world right? And are you seeking God's help in finding a way to handle a situation? David couldn't be Saul. Carson had to be himself. You must be who God made you to be. You can't use excuses like, yeah, I'm not as strong as David, I can't do anything. I'm not the leader of a team like Carson was, I can't get other people to do things. As my husband says, hogwash. God has given everyone what they need to do something for someone else. Be a prayer warrior. Pray for God's wisdom, courage, and discernment. Be a generous giver to someone in need. And many of you showed yourselves as generous givers at the golf outing. If you're doing something like a crop walk or food pantry, get one friend to join you. The Justice Leagues of superheroes are fun to watch and read about. And the Justice League of Old Testament prophets have wise words to heed. But our ultimate model and our hope for overcoming injustice is Jesus. Jesus started his ministry with these words. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind. Jesus came to make things right. Jesus took on a bigger opponent than Goliath. He took on Satan and all the forces of evil and death. Jesus conquered sin and death by becoming one with the broken, the hurt, the oppressed sinners like you and me, and dying for us. Jesus came to make what was wrong in the world right. But he did it by taking what was wrong in each and every one of our lives and making us right with God. The aim of the Christian life is by the grace of God to become more like Jesus. More dependent on God, more willing to stand up for the lowly, more willing to sacrifice. One of the Old Testament Justice League's prophets gave simple instructions for living the good life. Micah gave some dire warnings about what was coming in a world of injustice, but he also gave the people of God the requirements God had for turning these things around. They're still as relevant today as they are then. Micah called out to a nation on the brink. God has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. As we live through turbulent times, may we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Amen.